good afternoon. It's good to be here. I'm Robert Buxton, and I'm a classical pianist. I come to the fairways a lot, so you may have, if you've been there often. I play there a lot, but this is my first time here playing in the main room. So I was just joking around earlier. I'm not very uptight. You know, when you look into the history of classical piano or classical music in general, by the way, the word classical is what does it really mean? It's kind of one of those terms. You find that they really were not as uptight with things as maybe now, or the last 50, 60 years. They used to improvise a lot. And I like to improvise because I feel like it's connected to that heritage that, you know, we classical musicians, we used to have improvisation in concerts. So I'd like to start by improvising, and I need your help. If you can give me just a few individual notes, a few, like 3 or 4 or 5, and we'll create a melody, and then we'll see what comes of that. So anybody, I just need one note first. Which is what? A. Oh yes. Okay. A couple bites. I don't have perfect pitch. Okay. E. Okay, that's good. And now you can sharp or flat them if you want, or not. A few more. We have A and E. Yeah. I need a little more than that. B flat. B flat. Okay, good. Okay, that adds a little spice to it. A couple more. Come on, guys.
F sharp.
F sharp. Okay, that's good. That's pretty odd, and I like it. Odd is good. I don't know what to do with it. Let's see what happens. I'm often affected, though, by what I listen to in the car. And coming here, I was listening to the opening of Robert Le Diable by Meyerbeer, French opera. Well, he's actually born in Germany. So it might end up sounding like that. I don't know right now. So, with phone ring in there. Okay. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. So now I'm going to play the real program. And this is all music, you know, I'm obsessed with arrangements, transcription. Because when you do that, you can pretend to be not a pianist. You can pretend to be something else. It's the same thing as reading literature in translation. You can read Russian novels or ancient Greek plays, but you don't have to learn the whole language. And one of the many obsessions I have, too many, is the violin. And I'm just crazy about the violin, but I find it's too late to switch. But I keep thinking about it, and maybe one day, I don't know. But there are so many pieces that are arranged or adapted from the violin to the piano. Or maybe some of the pieces today are actually originally for something else, and there's a familiar, famous version for the violin, and there's also a piano version. That counts, I guess, for me. So that's what I've been doing for a little while now, and I'm slowly getting to the end of this theme and have to find a new theme. I'm actually thinking opera arrangement. That's why I was listening in the car to Meyer here. But at any rate, the first piece is actually from an opera, funny enough. This is the melody from Gluck's Orfeo, or Orpheus and Eurydice. And there's a very famous violin arrangement, obviously a piano arrangement I'm going to play for you now. But this opera, Gluck wrote it in 1762. He was from Vienna. And Gluck's prominence was a little bit before Mozart. He influenced Mozart a lot. Of course, in 1762, Mozart was about 6 years old, meaning he was writing plenty of things, at that point, with Daddy's help, of course. But that's the context of this opera. And the story is the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, in which Eurydice dies, she goes to the underworld, and Orpheus goes after her to save her. And he brings his harp, his lyre, spelled L-Y-R-E, not L-I-A-R, it's different. Meaning, and he plays this harp to charm the gods, to appease the gods of the underworld. And Hades finally says, you can take her back, but don't look back. There's a line like that in the Bible too. You might know, don't look back. And unfortunately, at the last moment, as they're going back to Earth from the underworld, Orpheus turns around, looks back, loses Eurydice forever. That's the tragic myth. But in the opera, this is also the Age of Enlightenment, the time of Voltaire and Rousseau. You can't end things like that. So they changed the ending around. In the opera, Cupid intervened, and Eurydice comes back at the very end. They have a celebration, and everyone lives happily ever after. But this piece I'm going to play is a lament. It's a mournful lament. In the opera, it's played on a flute, accompanied by strings. And, I mentioned violinists, but Jascha Heifetz played this beautifully. Misha Elman played it beautifully. On the piano version, this is an arrangement by an Italian 19th century composer named Scambati. What a beautiful sounding name, by the way. And this piece is one of those things that's less fashionable now. 120 years ago, you'd hear more things like this on concert programs. That's what I like about it, is it's a little bit old-fashioned. And Rachmaninoff would play this a lot. There's a recording, and it's just so beautiful. So, but here is Gluck, arranged by Scambati, the melody from Orpheus and Eurydice. to wake up. A lot of people will come to me and they'll say, you know, the classical music, I don't really get it. It's too long ago, or perhaps I don't have enough knowledge about classical music to really understand it. And I have two answers. My first answer to that is, well, you know, I don't know a thing about cooking, but I love eating. And so that's one way to look at it, is actually, I mean, it's helpful to know things about something, but you don't really have to know the theory of things to enjoy it. But the other things in regards to this piece is I think that if you've ever experienced the loss of a loved one, which unfortunately I think everyone has, you understand that music. It's that simple, I think. The rest that we could study about the history of it, so that's all, you know, commentary, really. But that's, you know, what it is. People are not all that different than they were 300 years. I mean, they maybe wear different clothes, we wear different clothes today. But humanity is, you know, people are people, so, and human emotion is kind of like that. It's universal. So now I'm going to play Felix Mendelssohn. And by the way, if you've been to the Fairways, and I've been seeing you every month, you've probably heard a lot of these pieces. You know, I hope not to bore you. I change the way I play it though each time, you know, a little bit. So, Felix Mendelssohn, I'm going to play his Auf Flügeln des Gesanges, On Wings of Song. It's a song for voice. And there is a violin version you can hear. You know, Yves Gitlis play it, Misha Elman, so many people that I love. But it's, you know, this piece is, yeah, I said it's a song. And because I don't sing, and I don't sing in German, I can't do that. I'm playing Franz Liszt's solo piano arrangement. Liszt did a lot of arrangements of vocal music. And you know, his thesis kind of was that the piano is not a percussion instrument. It's a stringed instrument. It's a vocal instrument. You know, it can sound like a human voice. So, you know, Mendelssohn was born in 1809. And he was a child prodigy extraordinary. He was even more of a prodigy, I've heard, than Mozart, meaning he was even younger writing music. But the thing about prodigies is this: we can try to, you know, rank prodigies of who plays faster and at what age, and that doesn't matter at all. A true child prodigy, in my understanding, is someone who at a young age, it's not about technical perfection, that they have maturity beyond their years and they will touch your soul even if they're 7 or 8 years old. That's what a true prodigy is. Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist, was a true child prodigy. You can hear him play at the age of 8, and it's just, you feel like he's lived so many years and has so much experience and depth and everything. So, Mendelssohn was like that. His soul was just, he was a wonderful person, as I understand, which is not always the case with the classical composers you read about. For instance, Wagner was not a wonderful person. That's an understatement. But at any rate, when I play this, you know, I feel Mendelssohn's character. You know, I feel his humility, his kindness. It's almost like he's talking to us 200 years later through this piece today. And Mendelssohn, you know, you've heard this before, you've heard me at the Fairways, but there was a convention at that time to use sheet music in a performance for pianists. They always would put sheet music in front of them. Liszt changed that. That's why I don't have music in front of me. I don't know if I'm angry at Liszt about it, but that's a different story. Now, Mendelssohn naturally memorized everything. So, but in order not to come across as a show-off, he would put sheet music for something entirely different from what he was playing in front of him, so that people wouldn't think he was putting on airs. That's the kind of person he was. And finally, what's interesting about Mendelssohn is he was Jewish, and he was from a prominent Jewish family in Hamburg. And, you know, his grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, was a scholar, a Talmud scholar. He actually, as I understand, created Reform Judaism. He started that movement, which is fascinating. But Mendelssohn, he ended up converting because the anti-Semitism of that time and place was such that he couldn't be a musician, really. It's really horrible to think about that, but that was a part of his, life story. And by the way, the poet who wrote the text to this song, which you're not going to hear because I'm not singing it, Heinrich Heine, he was also Jewish. I just thought that was very interesting to learn. So, Mendelssohn, arranged by Liszt on Wings of Song, Auf Flügeln des Gesanges in German. I probably said that wrong, but. Okay. Thank you. The way Google. So, next I'm going to play the 10 out of 12, Robert Schumann Paganini study. And I've been working through all 12 of these. You've heard all of them at the fairways if you've been there, one at a time. These are tricky. These are Robert Schumann's reinterpretations of, well, half of Paganini's 24 Caprices for solo violin. I don't know why he did half, but he just, I'm glad he did half, the cup is, what, half full, right? So, Paganini was this rock star-like figure. in the early 19th century. In the late 18th century, he was like a Jimi Hendrix or something of classical music, really, truly. And you either loved him or you hated him. He was controversial. People, some people hated him. They thought he was possessed by the devil. They said it. Robert Johnson, the blues musician in this country from the Mississippi Delta, people said similar things about him too. So this is not a new myth. But the Romantics, they came a little bit later, Liszt and Schumann and others, they just adored Paganini because he was such a contrast from that, Age of Enlightenment, the powdered wigs of the, Versailles and that whole culture. He was something different. He was just this wild maverick, almost played like a gypsy musician or something. It's wonderful. And Liszt and Schumann and others, they wanted to emulate that. So Robert Schumann in the 1830s, he heard Paganini play. And then he set to work doing these arrangements for the piano. And they're really tricky, my goodness. So, but I need to tell you also about Schumann, because Schumann's story is very interesting. And by the way, with these studies, if I were to play for you the first or the second one, they sound pretty close to the original violin music. They're almost identical in some sense. But these later ones, like this is number 10 out of 12, I don't hear Paganini hardly at all. I hear Schumann. I feel the sense of Robert Schumann's style. These were early pieces of his. And I believe that Schumann, in doing these studies, he found himself in the process. It's like you can sense this progression. Numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they become more and more Schumann and less Paganini. The same way painters or students of painting, they'll go to museums and copy the masters. That's what Schumann is doing here. Schumann's life was pretty tragic. He had bipolar disorder, and they didn't know what that was back then. They didn't have treatment for it, and he suffered a great deal for that. His first inclination was to become a novelist, and he was a great writer throughout his life. He created different characters, alter egos, and he would use them later in his music criticism that he would write. But two of those, actually, one of the characters is Paganini, if you can believe it. Two of the main characters of his literary, world are Florestan and Eusebius. Florestan, frankly, is his manic side. That's his manic character. Eusebius is his depressive side. And it's fascinating how he, in a literary way, describes his medical condition, actually. So that's a big part of his life. But actually, becoming a novelist didn't pan out. He wanted to be like E.T.A. Hoffmann or Jean-Paul Richter. These were novella writers at the time, very popular, still today, So he set about to become a virtuoso pianist. I think around the time he wrote these pieces too. And he practiced like crazy. He wasn't a child prodigy like Mendelssohn. And he got some device meant to strengthen the pinky finger. And he destroyed his hands. Couldn't really be a pianist at that point. And then he finally turned to composition fully. So that's, a lot of disappointments and a lot of things. But one big plus in his life that a lot of the classical composers did not experience. He had a wonderful marriage to fellow composer pianist Clara Schumann. And they had 7 children, I believe, and he was apparently a very good father, which you don't hear about other classical musicians. Like, they not good husbands and fathers and stuff, but Schumann truly was. He wrote music for his kids. He wrote the Kindersänge, So anyway, that's Schumann, and you hear all of his anguish and his suffering. It's in this piece, I feel it. And finally, I want to say there's something about the way he writes that he doesn't develop things in a normal way. His music is like episodic. You have one thing, and then boom, another thing. In this piece, you start with something very, mournful, like an elegy almost, like Gluck maybe, and then suddenly you have a march out of nowhere. Where'd that come from? And then you have something more playful. He always just has these sudden character shifts. A, because of his condition, bipolar disorder, but B, also because the literature he liked is like that. Splice technique, you can call it. Like some movies have that. You have one plot, splice another plot. And Schumann gets some criticism for this. I heard someone say, Schumann's music is just like shish kebab. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Where's the unity to it? Well, why do you need unity? Shish kebab is great, and so is Schumann. So here's the piece. So now I'm going to play a slightly longer piece. It's maybe not a whole lot longer than that, but Brahms, Paganini Variations, Book 2. There's 2 books of them, so today just Book 2. And this is based on the 24th Caprice of Paganini, which incidentally Schumann did not arrange. Famous theme. So, Brahms walked up to the Schumann's home one day in the 1850s, I think, early 1850s. He was a young man. He had written his 3 piano sonatas already. He had them with him, and he just knocked on the door. Actually, Clara opened the door. Robert was not home. She said, "Who are you? My name is Brahms." People were less suspicious than now of each other, I guess. But I need some water. Let me just get my water. So, Clara said, "Come in, make yourself at home, play me some of your music, please." And he did, and she was just amazed with this young man, boy really, and his music. And when Robert Schumann came home, he was astounded with Brahms. And they pretty much said, "Why don't you just live with us?" And they sort of adopted him almost. And he picked up a lot from the Schumanns. He absorbed their musical world, their cultural world. I think this was in Dusseldorf, so if I'm not mistaken. But unfortunately, Robert Schumann's mental and physical health would soon take a turn for the worse. He tried to jump into the icy Rhine River in winter, and he was then institutionalized, became nonverbal, as I understand. And in those days, again, their sense of mental health and medicine was not like now. They did not allow visitors. And I think finally, before he died, Clara ended up going to visit him once. But it's horrible. He died in an asylum before the age of 50, like 47 or something like that. And, it's just horrible. And Brahms was there helping the family. Clara was pregnant with their 7th child at this time, with Schumann. And so I tell you all this because there's a sort of a rumor or myth about Brahms and Clara Schumann, that they had a romantic thing going on between them. Of course, Clara was about 20 years older than Brahms. And from the historians I've read, they say probably not. Because how could it have been with all that was going on? And at the same time, I think they definitely had some unrequited feelings for each other. And Brahms remained a loner the rest of his life, and he and Clara would write these letters to each other. He would mainly ask her advice on his music, but there's something under the surface there from both of them, something unsaid. The thing about a love triangle or whatnot, there was a movie from the 1940s, Katharine Hepburn, what a great actress, but she played Clara Schumann, but the reality was probably not like that. I don't know, I wasn't there, but the point is that in Brahms's music, you sense always that there's something beneath the surface. One criticism of Brahms from some, not from me, is that his music is a little bit cold, a little bit calculated. For one thing, he was from Hamburg, North Germany, which is a city that's the weather is cold and rainy mainly, and people from Hamburg are not known for being wearing their heart on their sleeves. I know people from Hamburg, and they're very reserved. Doesn't mean that the deep emotion isn't there. It's just here. It's not shown all outside, and that's what Brahms' music is like, I think. I also think it's about his feelings for Clara. And it's this kind of Victorian era romance. Just the novels from that time reflect this too. They don't tell you all the details, but you can sense the inner, feelings of the characters. So anyway, that's the context of this music. And finally, there's something else that influenced Brahms a lot, which was he ended up living in Vienna. And Vienna is and always has been a very diverse place. It's actually on a map, you see, it's further east than Prague. So Vienna has always had this Slavic influence. And there's a Slavic influence, a gypsy music influence, klezmer even, in Brahms' music. Why would he write something like this? The Hungarian dances, that's for such a serious guy, that's pretty playful music. So there's that. Now, let me put this down because it's just I'm holding it. It's fine. What Brahms did with the Paganini variations is his intention was to write exercises for the fingers, that's it. And he has those, a lot of those. I play some of them, and they're tricky. But he started with that premise for this. And then he realized that musically they were interesting and good, so he changed it to a concert piece. So it's a bit like torturous in that way. It's so difficult for the fingers. I have a story about that when I was learning book one, there's actually one passage in book one that's especially gnarly in the beginning. And I was learning it, and I developed, which I've never had before, this terrible pain in my right index finger. I went to the orthopedist, it was swelling and stuff. And he said, "What's causing you pain?" I said, "Brahms." And finally, I have this belief, and this is a really silly story that really means, I don't know if it relates to anything, but I have this belief that, like William Faulkner said, that about history and the past. He said, the past is never really even past. In other words, the remnants of history, they're just alive around us, for better or worse. And here's an example of better. I was driving with my family through South Carolina over the summer. At the time, I was learning this piece. Had my keyboard with me too, and I was all immersed in the Brahms. And we get out of this rest area, and I see a guy get off a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. This guy with a leather jacket and everything. And he's got this giant white beard. Brahms in his later years looked a bit like Santa Claus. And I couldn't believe it. It was Brahms. He looked exactly like Brahms. And I said to myself, my goodness, it's like a reincarnation. And I told my wife and my kids, I'm going to go talk to him, and I'm going to tell him, you. And as I started walking, I felt someone drag my shirt, like with my wife. She said, "Don't you dare, you're not going to get the response that you're expecting." What is he going to say? Some crazy guy came to me. Anyway, but that's just to me, I think that the music, even though it's so old, it is alive today. Maybe that's not in a literal sense, but I just thought I'd tell you that story. I think I'm stalling because playing this is difficult. So here's book two of Brahms' Paganini. There's a lot of fire and brimstone, but listen to the quiet parts. The quiet parts, I think, is where this magic is. And maybe, perhaps, some of his unresolved feelings about Clara. I don't mean to pry. I'm not People magazine. I've said too much about that. So here it is. Thank you very much. So we're getting to the end of the hour, and I'd like to close. If you have to be somewhere at 3, it's okay. I'll be done, I think, just a couple of minutes. So I'd like to play some Southern gospel music. And people ask me all the time, what is with you play all this classical music, and then where's it? So it goes back to my roots, my parents, who incidentally, well, they live in Chapel Hill, not far from here, but we are very much connected to the people we come from, our parents. And my background is I actually grew up in New Jersey. Anyone from New Jersey here? Yeah, I'm from New Jersey. So there's some places where I don't advertise that a lot, but there's nothing against New Jersey. It's a great place and such, but a lot of us are moving here. So I grew up in New Jersey with 2 immigrant parents. My mother is an immigrant from the Soviet Union, and it was she and my uncle Boris, very Russian, Kalina is my mother's. They raised me on classical music. So that is where that comes from, that love of that. But the other, my dad, my other parent, is also an immigrant from southeastern Virginia. And so there was a funny thing going on growing up, listening to all this old-timey gospel and country and all this, and my dad was always telling me, when are you going to play some real music, all this classical stuff. So, well, I started playing some real music, as he calls it. And I'd like to play, this is something leaning on the everlasting arms. I'm going to play it in the style of George Jones, who's a wonderful country singer, gospel singer. They said about George Jones, he's the only person who could take the word church and make a 7-syllable word out of it. That was how thick his accent was. So again, it's a little bit like the Mendelssohn and the Liszt trying to adapt the vocal piece for the piano, or even Brahms taking Paganini and trying to, so that's, it's all about imitation in a way, isn't it? So here's an old-timey gospel tune, leaning on the everlasting arms. I thought I'd close with something a little different. So thanks for coming, and here it is. I'll do one more. This is very fast. This is a little different. This is more of my tribute to Mahalia Jackson, who I just admire so much. She was one of the great gospel singers of the 20th century, and she was kind of standing behind the civil rights movement too. The I Have a Dream speech Martin Luther King gave? He had written a different speech for that day, and it wasn't really going that well, and Mahalia Jackson was sitting right behind him and just shouted at him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And you don't argue with her. So he put his speech down and just started, and that's the famous speech. So this is a sort of a leftover from Christmas. I'm going to play just a real quick version of, and I'll play it fast, I guess. Go Tell It on the Mountain. So, my Russian piano teacher, I had a very Russian teacher in Texas. That's also more culture shock of the South and Russian culture. That's been the theme in my life, is that, and once he was teaching lessons on Christmas Day, and one student finally said, "Why do you teach on Christmas Day?" He says, "This is not real Christmas. Russian Orthodox Christmas in January." So, and according to that logic, we can still play Christmas music. Why not? Okay. Thank you. See you later. Take care now. Hello. Oh, thank you very much.